You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 171. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sarah Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers. I am so excited for you to listen to this episode because we have brought together 15 leaders to share their best wisdom on self-awareness. Some of these leaders you have heard already in January, February, and March, and even before that, they have already been guests on the podcast. Others are in future episodes. A couple of them are this month, some are not. You're not going to hear from them until this summer. But each one of them offer their best wisdom on self-awareness. Some of them share with us stories. Others just give us a quick tip. So you'll hear a variety of lengths and a multitude of voices. And as I was preparing this episode, I thought, okay, this is either going to be an utter failure or this is going to be really fun. And I hope that you have as much fun with this episode as I did. So let me remind you, you can find show notes for this episode at transformingmission.org/podcast, and you're looking for episode 171. On the show notes page, I'll link to the podcast episode that we have featured one of the individuals on this episode, or I'll indicate when we will be sharing that podcast. Some of them, as I said, are not until this summer. I've grouped them into 4 primary categories. There's a group of people that talked about self-awareness as God awareness. And then another group talked about self-awareness through the lens of seeing ourselves as other people see us. And then there's this beautiful conversation that we had with Amy Burgess, and Amy does many things, as you'll find from our episode with her this summer. But one of the things that she does is she serves as the person who brings the mascot, Rosie Red, for the Cincinnati Reds to life. And so Amy talks with us about kinesthetic and spatial awareness and how that impacts her self-awareness or her ability to do her job. And then we end with what I think we often think of as self-awareness around triggers and blind spots and some best wisdom in terms of being aware of those. So we cover a ton of ground on this episode. So without any further wait, here is the best wisdom from 15 different leaders from all across the country, well, actually around the world, that they have to offer around self-awareness. But I want to begin today with a conversation that we had with Jessica Moffett, and you'll hear from Jessica this month as we jump into accountability in April. And Jessica tells us a beautiful story of becoming aware of God so that we can be aware of self. So let's jump in with that, and then I'll come back and tell you who you're hearing from next. Oh, one more thing. Here's the simple question that we asked each one of these individuals. What's your best wisdom on self-awareness? Here's what Jessica had to say.
That's a good question. Thank you for asking. To answer that question, let me tell you a story. One time I was on an airplane, and I was on one of those Saturdays where I'd been to do a speaking engagement, and I had to preach next morning, and I wasn't quite finished. And so I sat down in my seat, and I put my eyes down into my papers and turned my shoulder just a little bit so that the person next to me would not engage with me. And when he sat down, he just sat down and said, "Hi." And I just said, "Hello." And I put my head back down. And he just kept looking at me. And in a moment, he said, "How are you doing?" And I said, "Fine, thank you." And I put my head back down. And then he said, "So where are you going and what do you do?" And I thought, well, if I don't answer, I'm going to be rude. So I said, "Well, I live in Tulsa and I work at a church." And then I said, "To just be nice." And I said, "So what do you do?" And when he replied, he said, "I am an accidental author." I knew the phrase accidental author, and I looked into his face, and I was looking at the author of The Shack. I was sitting next to Paul Young on my 2-hour flight home from Atlanta. So this was April of 2009. And you can imagine that then I said, hi, could I ask you some questions about your life? And I just put all my things away, and all of a sudden I'm the one incredibly interested in him. And so I began to ask him a lot about what it was like to be him. And he told me all about the book and the movie and, all of that coming and stuff. But then he said something several times in his conversation with me that I finally said, I've got to get a pen and I have to write that down. And it was this sentence that changed my life. He said, I am learning to stay inside the grace that was given to me for one day. I have learned to stay inside the grace that was given to me for one day. And so I had to ask more about that. And what he said is that during his life, he had suffered lots of fears of things that never came about. He said, most of us do. He said, sometimes awful things do happen, but most of the things we're afraid of do not happen. And here's exactly how he said it. My pen was furiously moving. He said, I have repeatedly suffered terrible things that didn't actually exist. 6 years ago, I came to the realization that I have experienced unrealities and all of the emotions that come with them. And I said, what does that mean? He said, well, in my imagination, I have suffered financial loss. I have been abandoned by my family. I have had my closest friends betray me. I've embarrassed myself in public. I've said something terrible. I've done stupid things. I've been to my own funeral. I've lost my job. I've lost all my teeth. I've come down with a variety of diseases. I've been mugged. He said, so you get the idea. He said, I've had volumes of imaginations in my own head, things that I fear about tomorrow. And as I think about the possibility of them, that in that moment, I feel all kinds of terrible, horrible emotions. And I scramble to manage my emotions in those situations that do not yet exist. I try to fix things in my head. I try to make sure they come out okay. I try to handle people who cannot be controlled and events that cannot be managed. And I do a very poor job of it. He said, in 2003, I began to wonder this. Does God even dwell in things that are not actually real? What if I am spending today's grace on things that will never be real? And then he said, my life tended to be gripped with worry, and I worked so hard to control or prevent something that I imagined could happen. And then he said, and I realized that scripture is really clear that there will be grace for that day, and that God will be in the reality that is tomorrow as much as God is in the reality that is today. And then he said, in 2003, I stopped the insanity and I decided to try to live in each day's reality within the grace that was given to me for that day. And then in the way that only he could say it, he said, and when I did, I had a new friend come live with me. I said, what do you mean a new friend? He said, Joy. Joy came to live with me when I decided that. And so we were quiet for just a little bit. And then he said, so I've given a name to my thinking. I said, okay. He said, I call it future tripping. Taking a trip to a fearful future that does not yet exist. And I don't recommend it. So we were quiet for a while. I mean, I just kind of had to absorb what he was saying. And I was in a kind of a tough time in my life. And I thought, well, how do I not worry about what I'm in the middle of? And so I just said to him this, but what if it's like something really happened? I mean, what if it's like a real reality? And I'm thinking about my own pain. I'm not telling him about my pain. And he said, well, let me give you an example. Tomorrow, they will be evaluating my daughter's brain tumor. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., I'm going to learn whether or not my daughter will live or if this tumor will take her life. And I just said, oh. And he said, there will be enough grace for me when I get there tomorrow. God will be in the reality that is tomorrow, just as God is in the reality that is today. And so by the time that plane landed, I was like, I'm going to live that way. I'm going to live just like that. That every time I start thinking about all the many ways something could go wrong, I would say, but when I get there and one of those things happens, will there be enough grace for me in that moment? Well, yeah. The God that I know, there'll be plenty of grace when I get there. And so how about if I don't live there? How about if I live here in this today? Life-changing for me.
What a great question. Will there be enough grace for me in that moment? And as Jessica reminded us, yeah, the God that I know will be there. There will be plenty of grace. So as we continue our conversation around what's the best wisdom that you can offer around self-awareness, let me introduce you to Chris Wiseman. Chris offers some wisdom in the midst of a tough leadership challenge and what he needed to be reminded of in that moment.
Don't forget your spiritual gifts. As the church split, I had no janitor. He was the leader that took half the congregation. My secretary quit. As the pandemic began to drag on, I tried to serve 3 churches while managing going back to in-person worship and then going back to online worship and trying to do an outdoor thing. We tried to do that. I was editing video. I was doing all kinds of stuff. And then God gave me the grace to realize that the church is all about the people. There was a lot of stuff that I was taking on that honestly I could have delegated so that I could fill the role that God has specifically graced me to do.
Next, you're going to hear from Marie Smith. Marie shares her best wisdom about self-awareness through the lens of practicing the presence of God. Let's hear from Marie.
So for me, self-awareness comes in the quiet. I live in the constant movement and there's constantly noise going on in my head. And so that can be in the form of words, that can be in the form of action. And so for me, self-awareness means that I have to calm all that down and stop. And so I find that quiet and practicing that presence of God grounds me enough to be able to do those reflection questions. It's that quiet that allows my soul to take a breath and then say, wait, you kind of messed that up, right? Like, wait, was that about you? Was that about somebody else? What was that about, right? And so it's in the midst of that quiet or that practicing God's presence that I can reflect and have that self-awareness. But I'm terrible at it if I haven't been quiet enough and been grounded. I have tried all kinds of other things to try to figure that stuff out, but I always come back to that very quiet time, whether that's at night, whether that's in the morning, it doesn't matter. And it has to be silent where I clear the noise out. So that's really important to me.
Here's a reminder from Tim Bias about what self-awareness is and what it is not, and how God is present in the midst of that.
For me, the best thing I can say about self-awareness is I've learned that self-awareness isn't self-consciousness. I lived most of my life being so self-conscious and had a false humility and all of that kind of stuff because I didn't think I lived up to what I wanted to live up to. I was not living up to what people around me wanted me to live up to, and it was all self-imposed. Only when I began to understand partly how I was created, and it was created good. I mean, I'm a child of God, so that's part of it. Another part of it is God's given me some strengths and talents that other people might share, but for me, it's given to me in a unique way. And once I begin to understand that, those are ways that I see it in a positive way. There are other things that I have experienced that help me make changes in my life. I mean, I would have gone most of my life thinking that I understood racism, but I was looking at it from a position of privilege, of white privilege. And so beginning to understand part of the position that I'm in and begin to see that, my self-awareness then changes or has changed, because now I see people as human beings. That sounds strange, but really I think that's part of the issue that we have. We don't see one another as human beings. I mean, even men don't look at women that way. We live in a culture where we've been objectified. So I'm learning those things about myself. Now, when I learn those about myself, then I'm more able to be in relationship with the people around me, because now I'm beginning to see more how they see me, and then I can relate to them in a more positive way instead of trying to hold people at arm's length. Long answer, but that's part of the way I look at self-awareness.
And this is our last piece of wisdom, but certainly not the least, on this section of self-awareness as God awareness. And we hear from Charles Boyu.
Self-awareness, I think, is one of the biggest problem of modernity, because I don't think modern humanity is self-aware. Modern humanity is more aware of others, but in a demeaning and competitive way. Because true self-awareness is to see yourself in others. The mission of God in the world is to make us aware of ourselves, and God has not fully succeeded yet. Because you can't, the two greatest commandments are love God with everything you've got and everything you are, and your neighbor as yourself. It is a 3-step process, and I know that is more than 3 steps. So from my unaware self, I see it as 3. God, others, and self. Those commandments stated in order of priority. That love for God, love of God, is the beginning of self-awareness. Because once you have God, then you are something. It's like there cannot be day without night. It is the night that defines the day. But we live in a time where the day is defining itself. So when we love God, then we are beginning to become self-aware.
Have you captured all of that wisdom? As we conclude the first section on self-awareness as God awareness and move into the second section, we're now going to begin focusing on how the people in our lives help us to stay in tune with our self-awareness, or maybe help us to see when we're not in tune. Let me introduce you to our next 2 speakers. First, you're going to hear from Cornell Graham, and then you will hear from Dennis Miller, and then I'll be back to take you on the journey with our next guest on wisdom around self-awareness as it relates to other people in our lives. Without any further wait, here's Cornell's wisdom on self-awareness.
I think it's just simply be true to yourself. First of all, take time to get to know who you are. And I think also is have some trusted friends who will always tell you the truth. I've got a few of those that I can count on to always tell me not what they think I need to hear, but will speak truth to me. And that's important.
My bishop often says, you know what you know, you don't know what you don't know. And so what we need to do is find someone to tell us what we don't know. That takes courage for us to step out and be vulnerable. But when we are vulnerable like that, we become a healthier person and we grow.
Thanks, Cornell and Dennis, for reminding us to look around and make sure that we have people in our lives who both tell us the truth and help us to see what we're not seeing. Now we're going to hear from Sam Heaton as Sam shares about his best wisdom as he is continuing to learn and grow from other people around him.
So I think this comes out of at least what I think is me being terrible at self-awareness. But I would say base your self-awareness on others' awareness, or maybe in better words, base your awareness of yourself on others' awareness of you. I think we're all generally not great at being aware of ourselves and really knowing ourselves and knowing who we are. So I'd say, seek the input of others on your personality and your gifts and your talents and your sins and your shortcomings and your brokenness and your goals. Preferably people who are maybe two sets of people, one set of people who are your close friends and another who are, people who are older and wiser and, in a more advanced spiritual place than you are right now. And ask them about, what do you think about who I am and my leadership and my production? And can you speak into my life and my walk with the Lord? I think we live in an age of expressive individualism. And so we think we're really fully capable of knowing ourselves and our wants and our goals and our desires and acting and expressing those in the world without or even against others. And that's what it means to know yourself and to be self-aware and to be yourself. But God created us to be communal creatures, to be defined not by ourselves, but in community and with other people. And so if we're trying to increase our self-awareness on an island, we're going against the grain of the image of God in us. And so I've been really blessed over, the past few years in St. Louis, both in seminary and starting out in ministry, with old people who speak into my life and, can call me out and can encourage me and direct me and, teach me really about myself and what they see in me. And I'm not going to name them because they would probably not be too happy with the designation that I just gave them, but they've really, they've helped me a lot. And I think I really understand myself a lot better and I'm aware of myself a lot better, especially, in ways that I could never, come up with by myself, even if I did have great things like the Myers-Briggs and StrengthsFinder assessments and things like that.
So since Sam mentioned it, let me offer my best wisdom around self-awareness at this point. Sam mentioned the StrengthsFinder assessment, and if you've listened to us for any length of time, you know that part of the coaching that I do is around the Clifton Strengths tool. And part of what that tool has done for me, and I try to help others use it as a tool for self-awareness, is both to see who God has created me to be and who I might need to partner with because of the places that I am not as strong in and might be my blind spots. Tools like Clifton Strengths have also helped me to see the places that I need to grow and how I uniquely bring those talents to life. But all of that has happened in relationship with other people. That as I begin to see, I now see how my achiever strength is just wanting to get this task done and not be present with someone in that moment. Then I become more self-aware. And the language of Clifton Strengths has given me a way to be able to name it so that then I can claim it and then aim it appropriately. So there's my best wisdom on self-awareness. Thanks, Sam, for bringing up the Clifton Strengths tool and also for reminding us of the diversity of ages that we have offering wisdom on self-awareness. Our next speaker, and this is the final one in this section on people and how other people in our lives help us to deepen and grow in our self-awareness, comes from Raylan Schleif. Here's Raylan's wisdom.
I think my response, and again, this is going to come out of my own personal way of how I gained some of my own self-awareness. I would say find somebody who you trust and be courageous. Be courageous about asking others that you trust how they perceive you. Most of us cannot see ourselves outside of ourselves. And so the only way we see ourselves is when we ask another person to reflect who they see us as being. And that's asking them, maybe you've just led a meeting or preached a message, or somebody has been with you, like another person from the church, another visitor from the church in a hospital setting, and they've watched you work with somebody and listen to them and offer prayer. Just be bold enough to say, I'd like some feedback. How did I handle that? What could I do different? What did you see going on? It could be that you've had an argument with somebody, and a couple days later you say, hey, can I have some feedback from that? So it's actually about being bold and asking for perceptions of others and how and what they see of us, and to not quickly dismiss either positive or negative. We're not just looking for positive, we're not just looking for negative. It's kind of it is a both and, but don't be too quick to dismiss it and bristle, but then to become aware of that, to take it into one's soul, to reflect, to ask God to lead us and shape us into new ways and being and new experiences, to trust that God will do that with us and for us, and to just, again, get brave. So only other people can help us do that. We can't become completely self-aware without others.
Our next guest is Amy Burgess, and this is kind of a bridge category because in many ways, Amy talks about what you were just hearing around people awareness and how other people speak into our lives to help us grow in our self-awareness. But she does it in a very unique way. As I mentioned at the start of this episode, one of the many things that Amy does is she brings to life Rosie Red, one of the mascots for the Cincinnati Reds. Listen to Amy's best wisdom about self-awareness through the lens of her role as a mascot and also through her own self-awareness as a human being. Here's Amy's wisdom.
I think self-awareness is really only as valuable as it relates to others. So like you can think that you're sort of projecting like a particular mood or an attitude, but that's only really made true by how other people perceive it. So I can think that I'm a good listener, but if the people that I encounter on a daily basis don't feel heard, then I'm probably not listening as well as I could. And, being a mascot, my self-awareness is directly connected to my sort of kinesthetic awareness, right? And my sense and my spatial recognition. But, there's times that I think that I'm doing something wildly funny and entertaining, and it just falls flat in terms of like reaction, right? So you've got two choices. You can try harder at that thing that you think is what is supposed to be happening, or you can take a step back and go, okay, that didn't land like I thought it was going to. And maybe I'm not reading the room quite right. I have to accept that my self-awareness may not be in line what others are perceiving at any given moment. And I can allow that to make me frustrated and get upset. But ultimately, you take the note and you try something different. So you have to be willing to accept that you're going to fail sometimes, even in things that you were so self-assured about, and that's okay. But honestly, like my self-awareness comes from the feedback that I get from other people, largely. I can sense when I'm getting like tired or grumpy in a suit and I'm like, I need a break. and I know that my interactions with fans are like less than what they could be. And it's not fair to them that I'm tired and grumpy. So like, I need to take a moment to step back and like, be like, okay, I need to like, this is someone's first experience and it's not fair to them. They don't know that I've been in this suit for 3 hours and all I want is a drink of water.
Our conversation with Amy will air this summer when we get to the point where we're talking about rest, relaxation, and play. But I hope in that small snippet, you take away a different perspective on self-awareness and perhaps begin to think about, are you willing to try again, or are you willing to receive that feedback from others so that you might grow in your self-awareness? Our final section on the best wisdom around self-awareness, I've put in the category of blind spots and triggers and growing in our self-awareness. That might be the easiest way to say it. We have 4 people that we're going to hear from in this category. And first up, we're going to hear from Barry Burns.
I would say there's 4 or 5 points that I would want people to remember. Listen more than you talk. Be curious about your own mind. Look for those blind spots, emotional, other blind spots in our lives. Ask for feedback often, and being willing to listen to the feedback. When you ask it, you have to be willing to listen and hear it. And then take the time that's needed to reflect. Reflect on who God's made you to be, reflect on your situation, reflect on what the reality is, reflect on mission. I think our spiritual life is a life of reflection that way. So I would say those 5 things would be bullet points for self-awareness for me.
Our next guest is Jen Lucas, and she speaks specifically about a couple of triggers in her life that help her to know that she needs to hit the pause button and do a reset and help her to become more self-aware. Here's Jen's wisdom.
Best wisdom for self-awareness. I think I have a few triggers that can either tell me I'm avoiding something or I'm missing something. The avoiding something, when I have started to binge watch something into the wee hours of the night and I'm not getting up in the morning for my own personal quiet time, then I know I'm avoiding something. I'm avoiding something hard. I'm avoiding a hard conversation. I'm avoiding dealing with something in my family, whatever it might be. I'm avoiding something when I start binge watching. And it's interesting. I've always had that, I think. But I've noticed it through this pandemic because we're home so much. And so I'm like, so that's one. And so when I start to get to, episode 8, when I just started it and it's an hour long, like, okay, turn it off. And then I have to start doing those questions of myself. Brene Brown has that question, the story I'm telling myself that, and I start to kind of say, okay, Jen, why are you avoiding this? Or what is it? That whatever, why are you trying to take yourself in another place through this Glee show, whatever it is? That's my latest binge, Glee. I never watched that show. Anyways, so that's one. And then the other is my husband is very good about giving me an eye when I'm angry or snarky or whatever on Sunday. And I have a level in my personality that my husband is aware that I have failed to have my quiet time or my own devotion time, or I'm avoiding something. And he just has this look with me that he's that guy that forces me to go ask that question of myself or to go figure out whatever it is, or is willing to listen to me vent, vomit, whatever. And there's very few people because sometimes people will give me a look or say, what's up with you? And I get angry and like, but with Troy, I have a trust with him, obviously, that I have to then go sit by myself and say, okay, well, what's your problem, Jen, and deal with that. So having that person that you trust and recognizing your triggers, that's, for me, how I become a little more aware of whatever it is that I'm doing wrong or avoiding.
Is self-awareness always a bad thing? A negative thing?
I think it is for me. No, because sometimes the look is, you're really ouchy today, Jen. And when I go sit down and figure it all out, I've realized that I haven't taken a day off in, 3 weeks. I haven't had my Friday to myself, or, my kids are home again because another snow day. So I think so no, it's that you haven't done anything wrong. You just haven't given yourself that permission to go rest, relaxation or play.
Yeah. Jen just called us all out on why we binge watch TV shows. In all seriousness, thanks, Jen, for those insights of what are our triggers, and may we all have someone like Troy who can give us that eye so that we know that we need to put ourselves in time out and figure out what's going on in our own soul. Our next guest is Joe Gary, and Joe is going to once again share a story with us about a time that he practiced self-awareness and when someone else was triggered. Here's Joe's wisdom in the form of a story.
I was in a meeting several years ago with a person in authority over me, when it seemed to me, abruptly, this person blew up, stood up, proceeded to ridicule, taunt, and insult me. This came without warning. There had not been any indication above the surface in the prior aspects of the meeting. But when it was when I gave an honest response to a direct question that the person asked in a very calm voice. In that moment of the blow up, and I would commend in any moment similar to other leaders, and unfortunately those types of things are very common today. The first thing I would commend is to pivot, not panic. Remember that, pivot, not panic. Remember that courageous leadership in relationships doesn't mean being aggressive or belligerent. Even when you may feel very justified, righteous, easy to rationalize that type of response. God gave me grace and stability in that moment more than I would humanly have. And I was able to pivot and not panic. And how I did that was I listened quietly to the leader, who later walked out of the room and didn't return, even at the end of the meeting. When the meeting ended very quickly, honestly, I simply gathered my things and left. And later on the commute, I received a call from the leader apologizing for their behavior and asking me plaintively, sincerely, to forgive them. Of course, with acknowledgement and repentance by the offender, I did. If I hadn't pivoted to self-control or allowed myself to panic and return vitriol, an important relationship would have been destroyed. Listen carefully. Do what you need to do to stay calm. Pause. Don't be impulsive. Learn to control your thinking. Learn from your mistakes. Demonstrate humility. Be a lifelong learner. Be honest. Show empathy. Give feedback. And you'll be the offender and need forgiveness someday. Apologize when wrong. As a courageous leader that acknowledges the need for healthy relationships, above all, be the adult in the room. Ask yourself as a leader, before an encounter begins, what is my role in this place, in this situation, at this moment, now? And when you say to yourself, I need to be an adult, it will call on, that's part of controlling your thinking. It will call on that part of you rather than, might I say, the reptilian side of your brain, which is more base and wants to hurt and harm at that point. It's just so naturally human.
Our final guest is Rachel Billups, and she puts a period and an exclamation point, as well as summarizes all of the wisdom that you have already heard on this episode. I'm going to let Rachel offer her statement of what self-awareness is and how she practices self-awareness. Here's Rachel's wisdom.
I'm going to answer this question by saying, sometimes I really suck at self-awareness. It takes something sometimes major for me. And the way that I work on it is through asking myself a series of honest questions. Usually I say to myself, hey, Rachel, tell yourself the truth about yourself. That's my phrase. Let me tell myself the truth about myself. I'll give you just a short example. This week, I was really ticked and tired on Sunday. And I said to myself, hey, tell yourself the truth about yourself. Why are you feeling this way? And I realized that I had really overbooked myself this week and that all of my frustration and anger were coming from that. And so then I asked myself, what do I need? And I realized that I need to reschedule my Easter filming. We're pretty early. We're ready. I'm ready to go. But I gave myself 3 reasons why I needed to reschedule. One of them was my calendar. One of them is I need another outfit based on where we're filming. And so I did. And just asking myself, basically, why? Why are you feeling the way you're feeling? Why are you operating the way you're operating? So I think some self-reflective questions are important.
I hope you had as much fun listening to these 15 individuals share their best wisdom around self-awareness as I did editing their best wisdom around self-awareness. I had a ton of fun putting this together for you and hearing the breadth and depth of voices, the different ages, and the different perspectives, men and women, our different heritages, and the way that we all see self-awareness as important, and yet we express it in different ways. And how they all came back together to really hopefully put an exclamation point, as I said at the very end there, on what it means to be self-aware and how, as a follower of Jesus, as a Christ-centered leader, you can continue growing in your self-awareness. So let me leave you with a few questions. I could probably give you 20 questions around self-awareness based on the wisdom that was shared on this episode. So I'm going to try and keep the list short. Here's my first question. This is an easy one because the answer is either yes or no. Is there enough grace for today? Second question, who are the people who tell you the truth or who tell you what you don't know? Third question, what are your triggers? Or what are you avoiding? The fourth one isn't a question, it's a statement. Tell yourself the truth about yourself. Once again, you can find show notes for this episode at transformingmission.org/podcast. You're looking for episode 171, or you can go directly to this episode at transformingmission.org/171. I'll link to each of the guests that shared their wisdom on this episode, and if we've already shared their podcast, or I'll share when we will hear from them in the coming months. You'll also find the questions that I've shared on the show notes page. And as always, remember, who you are is how you lead. Bye for now.